My billionaire father thought he held all the cards when he crashed my wedding reception to publicly disown me for marrying a public school teacher. He slammed a heavy contract on my sweetheart table, ruthlessly stripping away my $5 million trust fund in front of 300 elite guests. He laughed a cruel, victorious laugh when my husband calmly signed the waiver without a single fight. But my father did not realize that the mild-mannered man he just humiliated was actually the chairman of the private equity firm holding his entire corporate empire together. And he definitely did not know that by aggressively cutting me off, he had just handed us the legal clearance to dismantle his company piece by piece. I am Maya, 30 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful senior forensic auditor, I tried to escape their toxicity by living a quiet, unassuming life, but they never missed a chance to remind me of my supposed failures. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The soft, elegant notes of the jazz quartet floating through the Ritz-Carlton ballroom were suddenly annihilated by a violent, ear-piercing screech of microphone feedback. I flinched hard in my seat, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of the sweetheart table. The romantic ambiance of my wedding reception shattered in an instant. My father Sterling, a man who had built a billion-dollar logistics empire from absolute nothing and never let anyone in our social circle forget, it stormed onto the raised dais. He did not look like the proud father of the bride celebrating a joyous union. With his tailored tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his jaw locked in a furious grind, he looked exactly like a ruthless corporate raider preparing for a hostile takeover. Without a word of warning, he ripped the microphone directly from the hands of the best man right in the middle of a heartfelt toast. The entire ballroom of 300 guests, a glittering sea of the city's most prominent black elite, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. You could hear a pin drop over the expensive floral arrangements. Sterling marched heavily over to our table, his expensive leather shoes echoing on the hardwood floor. He did not offer a warm smile or a congratulatory embrace. Instead, he slammed a thick, intimidating stack of legal documents right onto the pristine white tablecloth. The aggressive force of the impact knocked over my crystal champagne flute, sending a river of expensive vintage spilling over the edge, shattering glass on the floor, and splashing cold liquid onto the intricate lace hem of my bridal gown. "You really thought I would let this happen?" My father's voice boomed through the microphone, harsh and unforgiving, echoing off the crystal chandeliers above us. "You really thought you could bring this absolute embarrassment into our family, and I would just smile for the cameras and foot the bill?" I stared down at the legal documents, the harsh black ink stark against the heavy white paper. It was a formal renunciation of assets. I had spent years quietly navigating corporate fraud, as an auditor, unearthing the dark secrets of powerful people, yet I had never felt as blindsided as I did in this very moment. I analyzed risks for a living, but I failed to predict that my own blood would execute a coordinated strike at my wedding. "Dad, what are you doing?" I whispered, my voice shaking with a mixture of shock and profound humiliation. "Please, not now. This is my wedding day." "You lost the right to call it a wedding when you chose him," Sterling sneered, pointing a heavy diamond-ringed finger directly at my new husband, Julian. "You chose to marry a public high school history teacher, a man earning 50 grand a year, a man who brings absolutely no status, no leverage, and zero value to this family legacy I broke my back to build." The collective gasp from the guests was audible. Women in expensive silk gowns whispered furiously behind their manicured hands. Men in custom tuxedos shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wide-eyed glances. My mother Vivian sat perfectly still at the head table, sipping her water, refusing to meet my eyes as my father tore my world apart. Her silence was her endorsement. My father paced in front of our table, clearly reveling in the captive audience, turning my heartbreak into his personal theater. "I gave you every opportunity, Maya. I offered you the world on a silver platter, and you spit on it for a life of mediocrity. You want to be a struggling teacher's wife, fine. But you will not do it on my dime. Sign the papers." He tapped the documents aggressively, leaving a smudge on the crisp white page. This is a total renunciation of your $5 million trust fund. You are cut off, disowned, effective immediately. You will not get a single penny of my inheritance. Before I could even process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his public execution, the sharp click of heels sounded against the polished floor. My younger sister Chloe strutted up to the table. She was wearing a custom couture gown that was arguably more elaborate, brighter, and certainly more revealing than my own bridal dress. She stood next to our father, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face, acting as his loyal enforcer. She casually adjusted her heavy diamond tennis bracelet, holding her wrist up just long enough to make sure the ballroom lighting caught the stones perfectly. "You should have listened to Mom Maya," Chloe said, leaning into the microphone my father held. "You could have married someone with actual status, someone who knows how to provide and protect a legacy like my husband DeAndre." She gestured grandly toward the front row of VIP tables, where her husband DeAndre sat flashing his gold Rolex and leaning back with an arrogant, self-satisfied grin. He looked like the picture of fake wealth, a man playing a role he had not earned. Chloe leaned over our table, her eyes filled with undisguised venom. "But you always had to be the difficult one, did not you? You declined the legacy admission to Spelman College just to prove a point. You threw away the network, the elite connections, the Alpha Kappa. Alpha Legacy Mom tried to hand you all to forge your own pathetic little path. And look exactly where it got you. You are a stubborn, broke embarrassment to this family. You always thought you were better than the social clubs, better than the charity galas. Remember when you refused to wear the designer gown Mom bought you for the cotillion ball, choosing to buy your own cheap dress instead? You have always wanted to be poor, Maya. Dad is just finally granting your wish. Sign the papers, pay for your own miserable life." My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I looked at Julian, expecting him to be flushed red with humiliation, maybe angry, maybe ready to stand up and fight my father to defend his honor. But Julian did not flinch. He did not yell. His body language was terrifyingly calm, almost unnervingly still. He sat tall in his chair, his tailored suit completely unwrinkled, exuding a quiet, immense authority that seemed entirely out of place for a public school teacher, being publicly berated and mocked by a billionaire patriarch. He gently reached out and took the pen from my shaking fingers. His touch was warm and steady, instantly grounding me in the midst of my family's chaotic theatrical cruelty. Julian looked up at my father, a serene, almost pitying smile resting on his face. He pulled the thick stack of legal documents toward himself. He did not bother to read the fine print. He did not ask to consult a lawyer or beg for a moment to consider the ramifications. He simply flipped straight to the very last page, locating the spousal waiver of claims, and signed his name with fluid, confident, sweeping strokes. He slid the heavy stack of papers back across the wet table toward Sterling, right over the spilled champagne. "We do not need your money, sir," Julian said calmly. His voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried clearly and steadily in the silent, tense room. "May your wealth keep you warm at night, because your family certainly will not." My father stared at the signature for a brief second before letting out a harsh, barking laugh. He snatched the papers off the tablecloth, clutching them like a grand prize. "Stupid, arrogant pride," Sterling scoffed loudly, waving the signed renunciation in the air for the crowd to see. "You two absolutely deserve each other. Have a nice, quiet life in the lower middle class." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the ballroom, his head held high. Chloe shot me one last lingering look of absolute disgust before linking arms with DeAndre and following my father out the grand double doors. Within minutes, the brutal exodus began. Over half the guests, the ones whose businesses, investments, and social standings relied entirely on my father's goodwill and money, stood up in unison. They filed out of the reception in droves, murmuring awkward apologies or simply keeping their heads down and avoiding my gaze completely. The grand, festive ballroom felt suddenly cavernous, cold, and devastatingly empty. I sat there frozen, my chest incredibly tight, hot tears threatening to spill over my carefully applied makeup. I had just lost my entire family, my financial safety net, and half my wedding guests in a matter of excruciating minutes. Julian leaned over, wrapping his strong arms securely around my waist and pulling me close against his side. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear, and his voice dropped to a low, commanding whisper that sent a sudden shiver down my spine. "Do not shed a single tear for them, Maya. Your father has no idea what he just did. By forcing us to sign that waiver today, he just legally signed away his right to family asset protection. The game is officially on, my love." 1 month had passed since the agonizing spectacle at the Ritz-Carlton. I sat in my minimalist, ultra-modern office on the 42nd floor of a glass high-rise in downtown Manhattan, staring out at the sprawling concrete jungle below. The walls of my workspace were stark white, intentionally stripped of any personal photographs or sentimental decorations reflecting the cold, calculated nature of my profession. I operated as a senior forensic auditor for one of the most ruthless, faceless private equity firms on Wall Street. My job was not to build companies up or offer strategic advice to struggling entrepreneurs. My job was to dissect corporations when they failed to strip away the glossy corporate facade and expose the rotting financial core underneath. I analyzed disaster for a living, and today I was staring at a masterpiece of absolute financial ruin. The serene silence of my office was a stark contrast to the screaming, laughing, and intense humiliation I had endured exactly 30 days prior. Here, numbers did not lie, and spreadsheets did not possess arrogant egos. The dual monitors on my heavy mahogany desk displayed a labyrinth of offshore accounts, falsified vendor invoices, and severely breached contracts. I was currently leading the compliance audit on a massive defaulting mezzanine loan portfolio that our firm had recently acquired. The data glowing on my high-resolution screens painted a clear, undeniable picture of gross financial negligence and blatant illegal activity. I traced the digital paper trail with surgical, unemotional precision. The primary borrower had systematically violated multiple default covenants over the past 3 fiscal quarters. Instead of reinvesting the borrowed capital into operational infrastructure and fleet upgrades, as mandated by the strict loan terms, the executive board had siphoned the funds through a highly complex web of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. It was textbook wire fraud executed with a level of carelessness that bordered on comical. I ran a cross-reference on the corporate tax identification numbers, meticulously matching the offshore wire transfers back to the parent company. I pressed the Enter key to pull up the final consolidated ledger, running a proprietary algorithm to unmask the ultimate beneficial owner. The progress bar loaded, and the name of the parent company flashed in bold red letters across my screen. It made my breath hitch sharply in my throat. It was Sterling Logistics. My father's billion-dollar empire was not just bleeding money. It was hemorrhaging cash at a fatal rate, and the digital trail of embezzled funds led directly to the office of his newly appointed chief financial officer, my brother-in-law, DeAndre. I stared at the screen, letting the magnitude of the discovery wash over me. DeAndre, the man who wore custom suits and drove imported sports cars, had used the company's operating capital as his personal piggy bank. He had breached the debt service coverage ratio, triggering an automatic acceleration clause. The entire loan was now due immediately. The sharp, sudden ring of my personal cell phone shattered the dead silence of my office, pulling my eyes away from the damning evidence on the monitors. I glanced at the caller ID flashing on the screen. It was Vivian, my mother. She had not reached out to me since the moment she sat quietly and watched my father rip my trust fund to shreds at my wedding reception. She had not called to ask about my honeymoon, nor had she texted to see how Julian and I were settling into our married life. I let the phone ring 3 times, savoring the unusual persistence before finally picking up. I did not offer a polite greeting or ask how she was doing. I simply answered and listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. The voice that finally spoke was completely stripped of its usual polished Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority haughtiness. Vivian was practically hyperventilating, her words tumbling out in a frantic, uncoordinated rush that lacked any of her trademark social grace. She sounded entirely unhinged, demanding that I pack a bag and drive to the family estate in Martha's Vineyard immediately. There were no pleasantries, no apologies for the wedding, just raw, unfiltered panic echoing through the receiver. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes still fixed on the glowing red numbers highlighting DeAndre's offshore transfers. You have not spoken a single word to me since you told your Jack and Jill committee friends that my wedding was a charity event, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and completely devoid of any daughterly warmth. Why call me now? Did DeAndre total another Lamborghini you bought him with company money? Or did the country club finally reject your annual gala proposal? Do not speak to me with that disrespectful tone, Vivian snapped, though the usual venom in her voice was entirely overshadowed by pure terror. Sterling Logistics is completely frozen. The bank accounts, the credit lines, the vendor payouts. Everything is locked down by some faceless corporate predator. We need you to come here right now and pull a second mortgage on your apartment to bail Chloe out. I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. The sheer audacity of her request was staggering. I stared at the red numbers highlighting DeAndre's fraudulent wire transfers. You want me to leverage my own home, the tiny apartment I bought with my own salary, to bail out the golden child you literally stood by and watched Dad disown me a month ago. You laughed when he told me I would be living in poverty because I married a public school teacher. Now you are demanding my money. This is a family emergency, Maya, Vivian cried, her voice cracking in a high-pitched wail I had never heard before. The federal marshals were at the corporate headquarters this morning serving subpoenas. They are threatening to seize Chloe's personal assets. She is terrified. You have excellent credit. You live like a pauper anyway, so I know you have equity. You can take out $1 million equity line against your place and transfer it to DeAndre's legal defense fund by tomorrow morning. Family protects family, Maya. Family protects family. I repeated, the bitter irony heavy on my tongue. Like the time you locked me outside in the pouring rain when I was 12 years old, because I accidentally stained my dress right before your cotillion gala. You let me stand shivering on the porch for 3 hours so I would not ruin your perfect black elite family portrait. Or how about when you told your friends I was a massive disappointment for refusing to pledge your sorority? You have never protected me. Now you want me to bleed myself dry to protect your crumbling facade. Stop living in the past, Vivian shrieked, the panic taking full control of her vocal cords. If Sterling goes down, we all go down. We will lose the Vineyard estate. I will lose my country club standing. Do you want your sister to be homeless? Do you want your father to go to federal prison? I want you to explain to me why DeAndre needs $1 million legal defense fund. I said, baiting her, watching the cursor blink on my screen next to DeAndre's falsified Cayman Island invoices. What exactly did the golden son-in-law do? He did nothing wrong, Vivian hissed defensively, fiercely protecting the man who had given her the illusion of high society perfection. It is a massive misunderstanding, a clerical error with some mezzanine debt lenders. DeAndre is a brilliant financial mind. He just needs temporary liquidity to satisfy the margin call until the lawyers can sort out this aggressive corporate overreach. You are his sister. You owe this family your loyalty. The pieces snapped together in my mind with a satisfying violent click. My current forensic audit, the breached mezzanine loan covenants, the Cayman Island shell corporations, and my mother's desperate hyperventilating panic were all perfectly aligned. Sterling Logistics was not just failing due to market forces, it was being actively dismantled by the very private equity firm I worked for. I was the one holding the scalpel. I looked at the executive summary on my screen, highlighting the exact clause that authorized the immediate freezing of all operational accounts. I had personally approved that automated trigger just 72 hours ago. My mother was begging me to save them from a financial execution that I had orchestrated through my daily corporate duties. I will be at the estate in 4 hours, I said calmly, ignoring her ongoing hysterical demands for wire transfer details. I closed my laptop with a definitive snap, severing the digital connection to her ruined empire. Do not do anything until I get there. I did not agree to drive to Martha's Vineyard to offer a loan. I did not agree to go there to save my sister or rescue my father's legacy, or preserve my mother's elite social standing. I grabbed my car keys and my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the cold, hard weight of the audit files inside. I was going to the lion's den not as a disgraced daughter, but as the executioner ready to deliver the final fatal blow. The drive to Martha's Vineyard gave me plenty of time to mentally prepare for the storm I was about to walk into. The ferry ride was usually a time for wealthy vacationers to sip overpriced coffee and admire the ocean view, but today the gray, churning water perfectly matched my mood. I navigated my sensible sedan down the familiar winding coastal roads, passing towering hedges and wrought iron gates that guarded the summer homes of the elite. When I finally pulled up to the sprawling Sterling family estate, the immediate visual cues of sudden catastrophic ruin were impossible to ignore. The pristine circular driveway, usually a showcase for my family's absurd wealth, looked like a crime scene. DeAndre's fleet of flashy sports cars, a matte black Lamborghini, and a cherry red Ferrari that Chloe flaunted constantly on her social media were parked haphazardly. But they were no longer symbols of status. Plastered aggressively across the driver's side windshield of each luxury vehicle was a massive neon yellow bank repossession sticker. The bright garish yellow clashed violently against the sophisticated backdrop of the manicured landscaping. I parked my car neatly next to a towering oak tree, taking a slow, steadying breath. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the solid weight of the audit files inside. This was no longer a home to me. It was a crime scene, and I was holding the murder weapon. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping into the grand foyer. The atmosphere inside was absolute, unadulterated chaos. The usual quiet elegance of the house was shattered by the sound of my father screaming at the top of his lungs. Sterling was pacing frantically back and forth across the custom Persian rug in the sunken living room. His usually immaculate tailored suit jacket was discarded on a chair. His silk tie was violently loosened, and his dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. Thick, prominent veins bulged dangerously along his neck and forehead as he roared into his cell phone, barking orders at someone who clearly had no power to help him. A few feet away, my mother Vivian was a portrait of shattered high society grace. She was huddled on the edge of a white velvet sofa wearing a silk dressing gown that looked entirely out of place in the middle of the afternoon. Her hands were trembling so violently that the ice in her crystal glass clinked rapidly against the sides. As she raised the glass to her lips, a generous splash of amber scotch spilled over the rim, staining the pristine white velvet upholstery. She did not even seem to notice. The invincible, untouchable Sterling family was unraveling in real time. Sterling abruptly ended his call, slamming his phone down onto a marble side table with enough force to chip the stone. He spun around, his chest heaving, and finally locked eyes with me standing quietly in the entryway. He did not look relieved to see his daughter. He looked at me like an asset he needed to immediately liquidate. "It is about time you got here!" Sterling snapped, his voice rough and ragged from shouting. He marched toward me, closing the distance with aggressive, heavy steps. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya. The banks are pulling a coordinated stunt. They have frozen the corporate accounts and locked up the personal lines of credit. It is a temporary cash flow squeeze, but they are going after DeAndre. We need immediate liquid capital." I stood my ground, my fingers gripping the handle of my briefcase. "And what exactly does DeAndre's temporary cash flow squeeze have to do with me?" "I am not asking for a favor," Sterling barked, pointing a rigid finger at my face. "I am giving you instructions. You are going to liquidate your entire retirement savings today. Then you are going to go to your bank and pull a maximum equity line of credit against your apartment. DeAndre needs a temporary legal bond, and he needs it wired to his defense attorney by the close of business tomorrow." I stared at him, letting a cold, humorless scoff escape my lips. The audacity was truly breathtaking. "You want me to liquidate my savings, the same savings you mocked exactly 1 month ago? You want the humble, pathetic teacher's wife to bail out your genius, chief financial officer?" Vivian suddenly stood up from the sofa, the ice clinking wildly in her glass. She stepped forward, her face twisted in a desperate attempt to manipulate the narrative. Maya, stop being so petty, she cried, her voice shrill and trembling. This is not the time to hold grudges about a wedding toast. This is about family loyalty. We are talking about Black excellence, Maya. We built a historic legacy, and you are going to let some faceless banking predators tear it down because your feelings are hurt. You have a duty to this family. You have a duty to protect your sister. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it in the air. I tightened my grip on my briefcase, my voice dropping to a surgical icy register. Family loyalty. I shot back, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. You want to invoke family loyalty right now? Where was that loyalty when I was 12 years old? Do you remember that night? Mother, I accidentally spilled juice on my dress 2 hours before your prestigious cotillion gala. Instead of helping me, you dragged me out the back door and locked me outside in the freezing rain so I would not ruin your perfect family photographs. You let me stand there shivering in the dark while you smiled and posed with Chloe for the society pages. You have never been loyal to me. You are only loyal to the facade. And I am absolutely not bleeding myself dry to protect your fake crumbling empire. My words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Vivian gasped, staggering back a step and clutching a hand to her chest as if she had been struck. She looked completely appalled that her favorite manipulation tactic had failed so spectacularly. Sterling, however, did not retreat. My defiance ignited a volatile, explosive rage inside him. He let out a furious roar and slammed his closed fist down onto the center of the massive custom glass coffee table. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the cavernous living room as a deep fissure spiderwebbed across the thick glass surface. You ungrateful, insolent little girl! Sterling roared, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. He stepped right up to me, his imposing frame trying to physically intimidate me into submission. You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can stand there and lecture us while my company is under attack? If you do not sign that apartment over to me today, I will personally destroy that pathetic husband of yours. You think a public school teacher is untouchable? I play golf every single Sunday with the superintendent of the city school board. I will make one phone call, Maya, just one, and Julian will be fired before the first bell rings tomorrow morning. He will be blacklisted. He will never teach in this state again. You will both be living on the street. He stood there breathing heavily, a triumphant, cruel sneer forming on his lips. He firmly believed he had just played the ultimate trump card. He thought he had found the exact leverage he needed to break me. Before Sterling could utter another threat, a heavy, resounding thud echoed from the front of the house. The massive, solid oak front doors of the mansion swung open with a forceful, commanding presence that completely silenced the room. Sterling spun around, his eyes widening in shock. Julian stepped over the threshold and into the grand foyer. He was not wearing his typical tweed jacket or sensible loafers. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, charcoal gray bespoke suit that screamed quiet, devastating power. And he was not alone. Flanking my husband on either side, their badges clearly visible on their belts, were 2 grim-faced federal agents. The sudden appearance of Julian in the grand foyer completely paralyzed the room. The heavy oak doors slowly clicked shut behind him, sealing us inside the sprawling mansion. Julian stood perfectly composed, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that radiated a quiet, terrifying authority. He did not look like the public school teacher my family had relentlessly mocked at our wedding. He looked like a man who owned the very ground he was standing on. Beside him stood 2 men in sharp, dark suits, their expressions unreadable, the metallic glint of federal badges clipped securely to their belts. For a fraction of a second, the only sound in the cavernous living room was the ragged, heavy breathing of my father. Then the shock wore off, and DeAndre decided to play his usual role. DeAndre stepped forward, pushing past my sister Chloe, who was staring open-mouthed at the unexpected intrusion. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture gathering on his forehead and ruining the crisp collar of his expensive Tom Ford shirt. Despite the visible panic in his eyes, he desperately tried to puff out his chest and project the arrogant persona he had carefully cultivated on my father's dime. He let out a loud, forced scoff, attempting to diminish the undeniable threat standing in the entryway. "What exactly is this supposed to be?" DeAndre sneered, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian. Did the broke history teacher bring his little hall monitors to a billionaire's house? You think you can just march into this estate and play dress-up? You are trespassing, Julian. You and your rent-a-cops need to turn around and walk right back out that door before I have security throw you off the island. Julian did not even blink. He completely ignored DeAndre, treating him with the exact same dismissive silence that one might reserve for a buzzing insect. He did not offer a witty comeback or raise his voice to defend himself. His absolute stillness was far more intimidating than any shouting match could ever be. Julian simply turned his head slightly and gave a single imperceptible nod to the men flanking him. The two federal agents moved with practiced, synchronized precision. They bypassed Julian and stepped directly into the sunken living room, instantly invading the personal space DeAndre was trying so hard to defend. The lead agent reached inside his suit jacket and produced a thick, folded legal document bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. DeAndre Rollins! The lead agent stated, his voice a flat, booming baritone that left no room for negotiation. We are executing a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of corporate wire fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of corporate funds across international borders. The color rapidly drained from DeAndre's face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped inside an expensive suit. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly. His knees buckled slightly, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the custom Persian rug. He looked frantically around the room, his wide, terrified eyes darting from the federal agents to Chloe and finally landing on my father. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the protection and wealth of Sterling Logistics, and now that shield was being violently ripped away. "Sterling, you have to do something?" DeAndre pleaded, his voice climbing an entire octave in pure, unadulterated panic. He threw his hands up, gesturing wildly toward the agents. "Tell them they are making a mistake. Call your legal team. Tell them to back off. I did not do anything wrong. I was just restructuring our liquid assets. I was executing the investment strategy we talked about." My father stood frozen by the cracked glass coffee table, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend how his impregnable fortress was being breached. I did not give him the chance to speak. I stepped forward, stepping out of the shadow of my family's chaos and fully into my power as a senior forensic auditor. I opened the heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the tense room. I pulled out a thick, meticulously tabbed financial dossier and dropped it onto the only uncracked section of the glass table. "He cannot save you, DeAndre," I said, my voice entirely devoid of anger. I was operating with absolute surgical precision. "Sterling cannot make a single phone call to protect you because Sterling Logistics no longer controls its own capital. You did not execute an investment strategy. You executed a suicide mission." DeAndre whipped his head toward me, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You do not know what you are talking about, Maya. You are just a glorified accountant. You do not understand high-level corporate finance." "I understand it perfectly," I replied, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You told my father and the executive board that you were investing $10 million into a revolutionary new blockchain startup to diversify the company's portfolio. You generated fake prospectus reports and handed out fraudulent return projections. But you never invested a single dime into any startup, did you, DeAndre?" I tapped the thick dossier on the table, forcing him to look at the undeniable proof of his crimes. "You completely violated the default covenants of a massive mezzanine loan that Sterling Logistics secured from Vanguard Heritage just 8 months ago. The terms of that loan explicitly prohibited unauthorized capital distributions outside of approved operational expenses. But you thought you were smarter than the institutional lenders. You bypassed the compliance protocols and siphoned exactly $10.4 million out of the primary holding account. You ran those funds through a highly predictable elementary layering scheme. You bounced the money across 3 different domestic shell corporations before finally wiring the entire sum into an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands." The room fell into a suffocating dead silence. Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth as she stared at her husband in mounting horror. Vivian remained absolutely rigid on the sofa, her eyes darting frantically between me and the financial documents, desperately trying to reject the reality unfolding in her living room. I tracked every single digital footprint you left behind. I continued relentlessly dismantling his false genius, piece by piece. You used the corporate VPN to execute the offshore transfers, leaving an IP address trail that a first-year auditing intern could have flagged. You authorized the wire transfers at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, triggering an automatic algorithmic alert in the lender's security system. You left a digital breadcrumb trail miles wide, DeAndre. The funds in the Cayman accounts have already been frozen by international authorities. You are completely bankrupt, and you are going to federal prison. DeAndre opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came out. He just stood there, his jaw trembling, looking exactly like the incompetent fraud he truly was. But my father, blinded by decades of unchecked ego and absolute control, utterly refused to accept defeat. Admitting that DeAndre had stolen from him meant admitting that his own judgment was flawed, and Sterling would rather watch his company burn to the ground than admit he was wrong. He snapped out of his shock and flew into a blinding, destructive rage. "This is an absolute outrage," Sterling bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. He marched around the cracked glass table, placing himself firmly between DeAndre and the federal agents. He pointed his finger aggressively at me, then at Julian. "You think you can come into my home and orchestrate this circus? I do not care what your little spreadsheets say, Maya. Vanguard Heritage is nothing but a faceless, predatory hedge fund. They think they can freeze my accounts over a minor covenant breach. I will tie them up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will deploy an army of corporate attorneys to bury them in injunctions. I will crush Vanguard Heritage in federal court until they are begging to settle for pennies." Sterling then turned his wrath entirely on Julian, his chest heaving with misplaced confidence. He truly believed he was still the most powerful man in the room. "And as for you," Sterling spat, stepping aggressively into Julian's personal space, "you are trespassing on private property. I warned you what would happen if you ever crossed me. I am calling the local chief of police right now. You are going to be dragged out of here in handcuffs, and I promise you I will make sure you never step foot inside a classroom again. You are finished." Sterling reached violently into his pocket, pulling out his cell phone and furiously unlocking the screen to make good on his threat. He was operating on pure delusional adrenaline, completely oblivious to the trap that had already snapped shut around him. Julian finally moved. He did not step backward, and he did not raise his hands defensively. He maintained his steady, unblinking gaze on my father. Slowly, deliberately, Julian reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. My father paused, his thumb hovering over the keypad of his phone, suddenly wary of what Julian was doing. Julian pulled out a sleek, heavy, matte black metal business card. The edges were sharply defined, and a single embossed crest caught the light of the chandelier above. With a smooth, effortless motion, Julian tossed the heavy metal card onto the coffee table. It landed on the pristine glass right next to the massive spider-webbed crack my father had just created and slid smoothly across the surface until it stopped directly in front of Sterling's hands. "You are more than welcome to try and crush my company in federal court, Sterling," Julian said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous timbre that commanded absolute obedience. "But I highly recommend you read that card before you make a phone call you cannot afford." Sterling glared at Julian for a long, tense second, his chest still heaving with indignation. With a sharp scoff of dismissal, he looked down at the table and snatched the heavy black metal card off the glass. He held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing as he read the minimalist silver text engraved on the surface. I stood silently beside my husband and watched the exact moment my father realized his entire world had just ended. Sterling stopped breathing. The aggressive, furious flush of color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His shoulders, which had been thrown back in arrogant defiance just seconds ago, suddenly slumped forward, as if an invisible crushing weight had been dropped directly onto his spine. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy metal card rattled against his gold wedding band. He stared at the engraved text, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mind completely failing to process the catastrophic paradigm shift. The man who had publicly disowned me for marrying a nobody was now holding the undeniable proof that he had just threatened to destroy the very man who held his entire billion-dollar empire in the palm of his hand. Sterling's eyes remained locked on the matte black metal card. His lips parted slightly, but the furious threats that had been pouring from his mouth just seconds prior were completely gone. The silence in the grand foyer was sudden and absolute, heavy with the terrifying gravity of his catastrophic realization. He stared at the crisp silver lettering engraved into the metal, his mind desperately trying to reject the information his eyes were processing. The text was minimalist, elegant, and impossible to misinterpret. It read, Julian Vance, Chairman of the Board, Vanguard Heritage. The air seemed to completely evacuate the sprawling mansion. Sterling looked up from the card, his gaze finally meeting Julian's. The blatant disdain, the arrogant superiority, and the mocking condescension that had defined my father's attitude toward my husband for the past 2 years vanished in an instant. In its place was a raw, unadulterated terror that aged him a decade in the span of a single heartbeat. He looked down at the card again, his hands trembling so violently that the metal edges clinked against his gold wedding band, hoping the words would miraculously alter themselves. They did not. Vivian, sensing the radical, violent shift in the power dynamic, stood up from the stained white velvet sofa. She clutched her silk dressing gown tightly around her waist, taking a hesitant, fearful step forward. Her voice was a fragile, trembling whisper as she asked Sterling what was wrong, begging him to tell her what the card said. Sterling completely ignored her. He could not tear his eyes away from the man he had just threatened to have fired from a public school, the man he had promised to leave destitute on the street. DeAndre, still sweating profusely under the intense scrutiny of the federal agents, tried to lean over Sterling's shoulder to read the card. When he saw the name Vanguard Heritage, his knees visibly buckled. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, stumbling backward until he hit the edge of the sofa. Chloe grabbed his arm, demanding to know what was happening, but DeAndre was hyperventilating too hard to formulate a coherent sentence. Julian finally broke the suffocating silence. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, resonant authority in his tone commanded the entire room, forcing everyone to listen with absolute, undivided attention. The mild-mannered, unassuming history teacher persona that Julian had so patiently maintained throughout our courtship, our wedding, and the ensuing months of familial abuse dissolved completely. In his place stood the formidable patriarch of a financial empire. He looked at my father with an expression of profound, chilling calm. Julian explained the reality of the situation with a surgical precision that cut straight through Sterling's remaining defenses. He informed my father that the Vance family did not build their wealth on aggressive, highly leveraged logistics contracts or flashy social media displays. His family represented old money. They possessed the kind of quiet foundational wealth that dictated global market trends rather than reacting to them. Julian told my father about his great-grandfather, a visionary who had capitalized on the 1920s banking boom, establishing a financial institution that prioritized generational stability and ruthless efficiency over public recognition or celebrity status. The Vance family did not just manage the hedge fund that held Sterling Logistics by the throat. They owned Vanguard Heritage entirely. It was a private family trust, and Julian sat at the absolute top of the hierarchy. Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward my father, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. The 2 federal agents mirrored his movement perfectly, a silent reminder of the hard power backing up Julian's soft-spoken words. Julian's voice was devoid of any warmth as he addressed the insults Sterling had hurled at him for years. He explained that he chose to teach public high school history not out of financial necessity or a lack of ambition, but out of a profound, unwavering sense of duty. He taught because he genuinely cared about shaping the minds of the next generation. He wanted to give back to a community that needed strong, grounded leadership and positive role models. It was a vocation, a calling that brought him deep personal fulfillment. Julian contrasted this sharply with Sterling's hollow, ego-driven existence. He stated, his voice ringing with icy clarity, that Sterling only cared about accumulating superficial power, collecting expensive toys, and crushing anyone who bruised his incredibly fragile vanity. Sterling built a house of cards on borrowed money to impress people who did not matter. Julian built a legacy of education while sitting on a fortune that could buy Sterling's company 10 times over. The public school teacher was the billionaire. The self-proclaimed business genius was effectively broke. The revelation hit Sterling like a physical, devastating blow. The domineering, terrifying patriarch who had ruled our family and his corporate boardroom with an iron fist began to physically crumble in front of my eyes. His broad shoulders hunched forward, losing their aggressive posture. The healthy color drained completely from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray pallor. For the first time in his entire life, Sterling was undeniably not the smartest or the wealthiest man in the room, and the realization shattered his entire worldview. But self-preservation is a powerful, desperate instinct. Sterling swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his unbuttoned dress shirt collar. He desperately tried to switch tactics, shifting rapidly from the role of the aggressive executioner to the pragmatic businessman. He attempted to salvage the unsalvageable, forcing a strained, incredibly unnatural smile onto his face. He actually believed he could negotiate his way out of a federal indictment. Sterling held his hands up in a placating, subservient gesture, his voice adopting a sickeningly smooth, conciliatory tone that made my stomach turn. He addressed Julian, attempting to establish a false, equal camaraderie that had never existed. He suggested that there had simply been a massive misunderstanding, a regrettable failure of communication between two powerful men of business. Sterling proposed that they step into his private study, have a glass of his most expensive scotch, and handle the situation man to man. The sheer desperation in his voice was palpable as he offered Julian a highly coveted senior seat on the Sterling Logistics Executive Board. He promised Julian unprecedented equity in the company, complete operational transparency moving forward, and a guaranteed annual return that would dwarf whatever penalty interest Vanguard Heritage was currently expecting to collect. DeAndre nodded vigorously from his position by the sofa, tears streaming down his face as he silently begged Julian to take the deal. Vivian clasped her hands together in silent prayer, watching Julian's face for any sign of mercy. All Julian had to do, Sterling pleaded sweat, now joining DeAndre's on his brow, was call off the federal agents standing in the living room, freeze the arrest warrant for his son-in-law, and formally forgive the breached mezzanine loan debt. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to bribe his way out of a federal crime, utilizing assets he no longer legally controlled. Julian did not accept the offer. He did not even entertain it for a fraction of a second. Instead, he let out a laugh. It was not a warm or amused sound. It was a cold, sharp, devastating laugh that echoed off the high ceiling of the foyer and sent a visible shiver down my mother's spine. The sound was utterly dismissive, completely rejecting Sterling's desperate attempt at a backroom negotiation. Julian looked at my father with an expression of profound pity, mixed with absolute unwavering disgust. He smoothly adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, his demeanor radiating total control over the environment. He informed Sterling that he was fundamentally misunderstanding the hierarchy and the mechanics of the current crisis. Julian stated that while he was indeed the chairman of Vanguard Heritage, he did not personally handle the granular details of corporate acquisitions, covenant breaches, or default enforcements. I do not make the tactical decisions regarding hostile takeovers and aggressive debt restructuring, Sterling, Julian said, his voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. I find the day-to-day micromanagement of defaulting portfolios and fraudulent executives to be incredibly tedious. I leave all of those operational decisions completely up to my senior forensic auditor. Julian took a deliberate step backward, physically removing himself from the center of the confrontation. He moved to my side, placing a warm, supportive hand firmly on the small of my lower back. The gesture was both deeply loving and immensely powerful. It was a physical transfer of ultimate authority, A clear, undeniable signal to everyone in the room that I was no longer the disgraced, disowned daughter they could bully and manipulate. I was the one holding the keys to their survival. I was the executioner. I stepped forward to fill the space Julian had left. The terrified, wide eyes of my entire family followed my movement. Sterling, Vivian, Chloe, and DeAndre stared at me as if they were seeing a stranger, someone they had never truly known. The shock and horror radiating from their faces were incredibly satisfying to witness. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. I did not say a word. I did not need to gloat or raise my voice. I simply reached down and unlatched the heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a gavel striking a sound block in the dead silence of the room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously bound legal file containing the complete financial autopsy of Sterling Logistics. The cover of the file was stark, pristine white, but the center bore a deeply embossed metallic crest that caught the ambient light. It was the undeniable, unmistakable crest of Vanguard heritage. I placed the file down onto the glass coffee table, the heavy thud echoing loudly against the cracked surface. My family stared at the crest, their expressions twisting into absolute unadulterated horror as they finally realized that the architect of their complete financial ruin had been standing right in front of them the entire time. The thick file landed on the cracked glass with a heavy, definitive thud. The embossed silver crest of Vanguard heritage caught the afternoon light gleaming like a beacon of absolute destruction. My family stared at it, their eyes wide, their minds completely short-circuiting as they tried to reconcile the disgraced, disappointing daughter with the devastating reality lying on the table. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the desperate need for approval that used to choke me. "I'm the one who audited your books. I am the one who discovered DeAndre's embezzlement, and I am the one who signed the executive order to freeze Sterling Logistics operating accounts at 6 a.m. this morning." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty crumbling to dust. Sterling stood completely paralyzed, his jaw slack, his face a terrifying shade of ash. The man who had spent his entire life dominating every room he entered was suddenly rendered entirely mute. He was staring at the daughter he had mocked, discarded, and humiliated, finally realizing that I held his entire empire, his legacy, and his absolute survival right in the palm of my hand. He looked at the file, then at me, then at Julian, his brain misfiring as it attempted to process the magnitude of the betrayal. It was not just a business loss. It was a complete obliteration of the social hierarchy he had enforced for decades. I turned my gaze back to DeAndre. The two federal agents had already moved in their hands, gripping his upper arms with professional, unyielding force. DeAndre was practically vibrating with terror. Sweat poured down his face, completely ruining his expensive grooming. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. I leaned forward, resting my fingertips lightly on the Vanguard file. "You thought you were a mastermind, DeAndre?" I said, my tone laced with clinical disgust. "You actually believed you could outsmart institutional auditors by categorizing your massive embezzlement as fleet maintenance and offshore infrastructure development. But you did not even bother to cover your tracks. You operated with the staggering arrogance of a man who thought he was completely untouchable. You purchased a $2 million yacht in St. Bart's and tried to bury the transaction under a ledger line for semi-truck tire replacements. You bought Chloe a $600,000 diamond necklace and coded it as warehouse liability insurance. It was pathetic." DeAndre shook his head wildly, his breathing shallow and panicked. No, it was a restructuring plan. I had a plan to pay it back. I just needed more time." "You did not have a plan. You had a piggy bank," I countered, my voice sharp and cutting. "You left a digital trail so glaringly obvious that a first-year accounting student could have caught it before lunch. You used your personal corporate laptop to log into the Cayman Shell accounts. You tied the wire transfers to your own social security number. You did not just steal, you stole with breathtaking incompetence." The lead FBI agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound echoed through the grand foyer as he locked them tightly around DeAndre's wrists. DeAndre let out a loud, pathetic sob, his knees finally giving out completely. The agents had to physically haul him upward, holding him by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the stained Persian rug. The golden son-in-law, the supposed financial prodigy who was meant to carry the Sterling legacy into the future, was weeping like a child. Seeing DeAndre in federal handcuffs finally snapped Sterling out of his paralysis. The shock mutated into a desperate, frantic denial. He could not accept that he had been outplayed by his own blood. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest, and tried to summon the booming, authoritarian voice that had terrorized me throughout my entire childhood. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, attempting to reassert a dominance that no longer existed. "You listen to me right now, Maya," Sterling ordered, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, though it lacked its usual terrifying conviction. "You are my daughter. You carry the Sterling name. I do not care what title you hold at that firm, and I do not care what papers you have in that briefcase. You are going to pick up your phone, you are going to call your office, and you will unfreeze those accounts right now. You are going to call off these agents. You are going to fix this mess. That is a direct order from your father." I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate command hang in the dead air. I looked at this man, this tyrant who had demanded perfection but rewarded only blind obedience. I looked at the father who had publicly disowned me simply because I refused to marry a man who would serve his corporate interests. "You told me at 16 that I was too analytical," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous whisper that commanded the entire room. "You told me I was too cold and that I lacked the grace to succeed in our social circles. You said I would never fit into your world because I cared more about numbers than networking. You told me my mind was a liability because it lacked warmth." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He instinctively took a half step backward. "You were right about one thing, Dad. I am cold, and that is exactly what makes me an exceptional auditor. I do not care about your social circles. I do not care about your legacy. I care about the ledger. And your ledger is bleeding out. I am not calling my office, and I am absolutely not unfreezing your accounts. You built an empire on intimidation, but numbers cannot be intimidated. You are going to face the exact consequences of the incompetence you chose to blindly reward." Sterling staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. The illusion of his control was completely shattered. He looked at Vivian for support, but my mother was utterly useless. She had collapsed entirely onto the white velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands, weeping loudly as she mourned the death of her high society status. The country club galas, the charity balls, the lavish vacations, the designer wardrobes, everything she valued was gone, erased by a single signature on a federal warrant. She was not crying for her family. She was crying for her credit limit. And then the reality of the situation finally penetrated Chloe's thick layer of entitlement. My older sister had been standing near the grand staircase, her manicured entitlement. My older sister had been standing near the grand staircase, her manicured hands clutching the mahogany banister. She had watched her husband get placed in handcuffs. She had seen the neon yellow repossession stickers on her imported sports cars outside. She had listened to me methodically outline the total, irreversible evaporation of her wealth. She finally grasped that they were entirely, completely broke. The endless bank accounts, the limitless credit cards, the private jets, the entire foundation of her narcissistic existence, they were all gone. She was going to be the wife of a convicted felon, stripped of every luxury she had ever known. Chloe's shock instantly morphed into a violent, unhinged wrath. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. She stomped down the 2 stairs into the sunken living room, her designer heels sinking into the expensive rug. She lunged toward me, her hands curled into fists, ready to physically attack the messenger of her demise. Julian smoothly shifted his weight, positioning his tall, imposing frame firmly between me and my sister. He did not raise his hands, but his presence alone was a physical barrier she could not breach. Chloe stopped abruptly, forced to confront the solid wall of my husband, but her mouth did not stop moving. She leveled a venomous, furious glare at me, her chest heaving with rage. "You planned this!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the foyer, completely devoid of her usual polished elegance. "You disgusting, vindictive little snake. You orchestrated this whole thing out of spite because you have always been jealous of me. You have always been the ugly, boring sister who never got any attention. You set DeAndre up because you could not handle the fact that Mom and Dad loved us more. You are just a jealous, spiteful bitch trying to ruin my life because yours is so pathetic." I stepped around Julian, moving out from behind his protective stance. I did not need him to shield me from Chloe. I had spent my entire life biting my tongue, shrinking myself down to make room for her massive, fragile ego. I had watched her steal the spotlight, take credit for my work, and manipulate our parents into giving her whatever she wanted. I had endured her condescension and her cruelty for 29 years. I had allowed her to treat me like a subordinate in my own home. But today the rules had permanently changed. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked younger sister. I was the woman holding the deed to her financial execution. I turned my attention away from the broken, stuttering mess of my father. I locked my analytical, unfeeling gaze directly onto the golden child, ready to systematically dismantle the illusion of her perfect life. Chloe did not back down. Instead, she doubled down on the toxic delusion that had shielded her for her entire adult life. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her features flushed with a volatile mixture of panic and deep-seated, unshakable entitlement. She screamed that I was completely out of my mind. She launched into a frantic, high-pitched defense of the man currently standing in federal handcuffs just a few feet away. According to my sister, DeAndre was a visionary. He was a brilliant, unmatched provider who had elevated the Sterling family name to new, unprecedented heights. She accused me of orchestrating this entire federal investigation out of pure, unadulterated spite. In her twisted, carefully curated reality, I was nothing but the bitter, ugly duckling of the family, desperately trying to ruin her flawless marriage because I could not secure a high-value man of my own. She reminded everyone in the room, her voice echoing shrilly off the imported marble floors, about her million-dollar lifestyle. She screamed about the lavish first-class vacations they took to Dubai, the custom jewelry he bought her for no reason, and the flawless black elite image they projected to her millions of devoted followers on Instagram. She insisted that my forensic audit was a fabricated, jealous lie, a desperate attempt by a pathetic sibling to steal the spotlight she rightfully owned. She was hyperventilating, her designer heels clicking erratically on the floor as she demanded that the FBI agents release her husband immediately. She claimed DeAndre was simply too smart, too successful, and too fiercely dedicated to her to ever commit a crime. I let her scream. I let the frantic echoes of her delusional defense bounce off the soaring walls of the grand foyer. When she finally paused to take a ragged, desperate breath, I reached back into my leather briefcase. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or attempt to match her hysterical energy. I maintained a surgical, absolute calm that seemed to unnerve her more than a screaming match ever could. I pulled out a secondary file, this one a stark standard manila folder, and placed it gently on top of the Vanguard Heritage dossier. "You are right about one thing, Chloe," I said, my tone flat and entirely conversational. DeAndre did not lose the $10 million in a failed blockchain investment. He did not make a bad business decision. He knew exactly what he was doing with that money. I flipped the folder open. Inside were stacks of highly detailed, highlighted financial statements, certified property deeds, and offshore wire transfer logs. I traced my index finger down the top page, reading the undeniable facts aloud to the dead silent room. The money that was siphoned out of Sterling Logistics did not just sit in a Cayman Islands shell account gathering interest. I explained, keeping my eyes locked on her horrified, pale face. It was carefully and intentionally redistributed. $2.4 million was wired directly to a luxury real estate developer in South Beach, Miami. The deed to the penthouse condo is not in your name, Chloe. It is not in DeAndre's name either. The property is legally registered to a woman named Jasmine Carter. Chloe stopped breathing. The manic, aggressive energy completely drained from her body, replaced by a sudden, terrifying stillness. Her eyes widened, tracking my finger as it moved to the next highlighted document. "And the rest of the embezzled funds?" I continued, my voice steady and unyielding, "were funneled into an irrevocable offshore trust fund. A trust fund that DeAndre set up exactly 4 months ago, right around the time you posted those anniversary photos from Paris. The primary beneficiary of that trust is not you. It is not your future children. The sole exclusive beneficiary is Jasmine Carter. DeAndre did not steal from our father to build your perfect life. He stole from our father to fund a completely secret secondary life with his mistress." Chloe let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She lunged forward, her hands trembling violently as she snatched the thick stack of papers right out of the folder. She held them up close to her face, her eyes darting frantically across the highlighted transactions, the certified property deed, the trust fund documentation, and the unmistakable glossy photographs of a stunning multi-million-dollar Miami penthouse. The visual evidence was absolute and undeniable. Every single transaction bore DeAndre's verified digital signature. The flawless, highly curated reality she had meticulously constructed and flaunted on the internet for years shattered into a million irreparable pieces in her hands. Her perfect marriage was a total, humiliating sham. Her brilliant provider was a common thief who was funding a mistress with her father's stolen money. DeAndre panicked. He strained against the cold steel cuffs binding his wrists, his face contorting into a mask of pathetic desperation. He looked at Chloe, heavy tears streaming down his sweating face, and tried to launch into a frantic, stuttering denial. He swore the documents were doctored. He claimed Jasmine was just a high-end real estate consultant he was using for a confidential corporate expansion project in Florida. He begged Chloe not to listen to me, aggressively swearing his undying love and absolute loyalty to her. His voice was shrill and whining, entirely devoid of the confident, arrogant swagger he had displayed just an hour ago. The lead FBI agent did not let the pathetic lie stand. He stepped forward, his expression hard and entirely unsympathetic. "The documents are entirely authentic, Mrs. Rollins," the agent stated, his deep voice cutting through DeAndre's whining. "Our cyber division independently verified the wire transfers and the property deeds yesterday evening. The Miami property has already been seized by the federal government, and the offshore trust fund accounts have been permanently frozen. Your husband is currently facing an additional federal charge for attempting to conceal illicit funds through a third party." The absolute finality of the federal agent's words hit Chloe with the force of a freight train. Her knees completely gave out. She collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug in a heap of designer silk, the damning financial documents scattering around her like fallen autumn leaves. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest and began to weep, loud, racking, ugly sobs that shook her entire frame. She looked up through her tears, her eyes instinctively searching for Vivian. She was waiting for our mother to rush forward to coddle her, to wrap her in a warm embrace, and promise her that everything would be magically fixed, just like she had done every single time Chloe faced the slightest inconvenience in her pampered life. But Vivian remained frozen on the stained velvet sofa, completely incapacitated by her own devastating loss of status and wealth. There was no comfort coming. Chloe was entirely alone with her ruin. I stood over my sister, watching the golden child weep among the hard evidence of her husband's infidelity and massive fraud. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no urge to kneel down, comfort her, or offer any form of sisterly support. "You spent my entire wedding day parading around the reception, telling all of your elite society friends that I was a massive disappointment," I said, my voice cutting through her loud sobs with icy precision. "You took the microphone and gave a toast about how I was throwing my life away by marrying a nobody. You laughed in my face when Dad ripped up my trust fund. You told me I was destined for a life of pathetic mediocrity while you were living a modern fairy tale." I leaned down slightly, ensuring she heard every single syllable over her own crying. "Enjoy your billionaire lifestyle, Chloe. Enjoy the lavish Dubai vacations and the flawless Instagram aesthetic. Oh, wait. I almost forgot to mention the operational logistics of the foreclosure. The feds are executing a secondary asset forfeiture warrant at your primary residence tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. They are seizing the imported cars, the custom jewelry, and every single one of your precious Birkin bags to satisfy the Vanguard Heritage debt recovery protocols. You are not a billionaire's wife anymore. You are the broke wife of a federal inmate. The sound of my sister's devastating sobs filled the grand foyer, mingling with DeAndre's frantic, hushed pleas as the FBI agents began to physically turn him toward the massive oak doors. The empire was officially dead. The financial execution was complete, but Vivian could not endure the silence. Witnessing the complete total breakdown of her golden child, watching her favored son-in-law being dragged away in handcuffs, and realizing that the daughter she had relentlessly abused was now the single most powerful person in the room, finally forced my mother to act. She could not use money to control me anymore. She could not use social status to intimidate me. She only had one weapon left in her arsenal. Vivian slowly stood up from the ruined white sofa. She wiped a single tear from her cheek, her face shifting into a mask of profound, tragic suffering. She ignored the FBI agents, and she ignored her weeping daughter on the floor. She stepped carefully over the scattered financial documents and walked directly toward me. She reached out her trembling hands, attempting to grasp mine, playing the ultimate toxic manipulation card she had kept in reserve for decades. She was preparing to crush me with the suffocating weight of a mother's sacrifice. Vivian's perfectly manicured fingers clamped around my wrists with a desperate claw-like grip. Her skin was freezing slick with the cold sweat of sudden absolute panic. She looked up at me through a curtain of meticulously applied mascara, her eyes wide and brimming with heavy theatrical tears. This was the performance of a lifetime. She had spent my entire existence perfecting the art of emotional manipulation, and now facing the total annihilation of her pampered lifestyle, she was bringing out her heavy artillery. "Maya, my sweet, brilliant girl," Vivian whispered, her voice quivering with a fragile manufactured vulnerability. She squeezed my hands, attempting to pull me closer, attempting to bridge a chasm she had spent 29 years digging. "You have to listen to me. You have to look into your mother's heart and understand why things were the way they were." I did not pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting her spin her web, watching the desperate mechanics of her mind working in overdrive. "I know I was hard on you," Vivian sobbed, a single tear tracking perfectly down her cheek, avoiding her blush. "I know I demanded perfection, and I know I pushed you away when you needed comfort. But you have to understand the world we live in, Maya. The world is incredibly cruel, especially to women who look like us. As a Black woman, you have to be twice as smart, twice as tough, and twice as ruthless, just to get half the recognition. You were always so sensitive. You were always so soft-hearted. I had to toughen you up. I had to forge you into iron so the world would not break you. Every criticism, every time I favored your sister, it was a test. It was my way of protecting you. I was giving you the armor you needed to survive." She paused, letting out a ragged, trembling breath, waiting for the guilt to set in. When my expression remained completely unchanged, she pivoted seamlessly, invoking a higher, almost sacred cause to shield her own greed. "And now look at what you are doing," Vivian pleaded, her voice taking on a desperate preaching cadence. "You are letting your petty, childish vindictiveness blind you to the bigger picture. Your father did not just build a company, he built a historic Black-owned empire. He built a beacon of excellence for our entire community. Do you know what our ancestors sacrificed so we could stand in a house like this? Do you know the blood and sweat it took to build sterling logistics from nothing? And you are just going to burn it to the ground because you felt left out of a few family dinners. You are going to hand our generational wealth over to some faceless federal agents over a misunderstanding, Maya. You are destroying our legacy." The sheer audacity of her narrative was almost breathtaking. She was actually standing in a foyer bought with embezzled funds, looking at a son-in-law in federal handcuffs and trying to use the historical suffering of our ancestors to guilt-trip the auditor who caught them stealing. I looked down at her hands, gripping my wrists. I did not yank them away. I simply rotated my arms and smoothly, forcefully detached myself from her grasp. I took a single step back, creating a definitive physical boundary between her fabricated emotion and my absolute reality. Do not ever invoke the struggles of our ancestors to justify your profound, bottomless vanity. Mother, I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp surgical edge that sliced straight through her manufactured tears. You did not push me to be stronger. You pushed me away because I was not a useful accessory. I was not loud. I was not glamorous. And I did not photograph well for your country club newsletters. You did not give me armor. You gave me a lifetime of inadequacy, while you wrapped Chloe in a protective layer of stolen money. Vivian opened her mouth to protest, her face flushing with indignant rage at being challenged. But I did not give her a fraction of a second to speak. I was the senior forensic auditor, and it was time to present the final findings. You do not care about a historic Black-owned business. I continued, my words hitting her like physical strikes. You care about your front row seats at the annual charity galas. You care about making sure your elite society friends think you are royalty. You care about the prestige, the envy in their eyes, and the unlimited access to the VIP lounges. Sterling Logistics ceased to be a functioning logistics company 3 years ago. It became a personal slush fund to finance your desperate need to be the queen of the social scene. I pointed to the Vanguard heritage file resting on the cracked glass coffee table. I traced the origin of every single dollar that funded your lifestyle. I stated, breaking down her entire existence into cold, unforgiving ledger entries. The $50,000 platinum table you bought at the Heritage Foundation Gala last month that was paid for directly out of the Sterling employee payroll tax escrow account. Your $100,000 initiation fee for the Oak Point Country Club, DeAndre diverted that from the company's regional warehouse maintenance budget. Your entire social identity is a highly leveraged, fraudulent illusion. Vivian shook her head rapidly, her carefully maintained posture finally breaking. Her hands flew to her neck, her fingers clutching at her diamond necklace, as if she were suddenly suffocating. No! She gasped, her voice losing all its theatrical grace and reverting to a raw, genuine panic. No, those are private family expenses. Sterling handles the accounting. You do not know what you are talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, I replied, my gaze locking onto her terrified eyes, refusing to let her look away from the wreckage. Because I am the one who cut the strings. When I signed the executive order to freeze Sterling Logistics operating accounts at 6 o'clock this morning, I did not just freeze the corporate payroll, I froze every single account linked to the company's routing numbers. That includes the shadow accounts DeAndre set up to auto-pay your personal expenses. The blood completely drained from Vivian's face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She was beginning to comprehend the immediate catastrophic social implications of my words. Today is the first of the month, Mother, I reminded her, delivering the final fatal blow to her ego. Do you know what happens on the first of the month? The automatic drafts for your elite social club memberships, your country club dues, and your private society benefactor pledges are processed. Or rather, they attempt to process. I let the silence hang for a brief moment, watching the sheer terror wash over her features. Every single one of your membership payments bounced this morning. I revealed, my voice steady and merciless. But it gets worse. Because those club fees were historically paid using stolen corporate funds, Vanguard Heritage compliance protocols required me to formally notify the receiving institutions of the federal fraud investigation. I personally drafted the legal notices to the board of directors of the Oak Point Country Club, the Heritage Foundation, and the Diamond Society. I informed them that the money you have been paying them is currently subject to federal asset forfeiture. Vivian let out a strangled, horrific gasp. It was not a theatrical sob. It was the sound of a woman watching her actual life end. Your entire social standing is gone, I stated, stripping away the last remaining shred of her dignity. Your memberships are revoked. Your seats at the galas are canceled. Your elite circle of friends will read those board notices before lunchtime. By tomorrow morning, every single woman you have spent the last decade trying to impress will know that you are completely bankrupt, that your son-in-law is a felon, and that you have been funding your lavish lifestyle with stolen money. You are a social pariah. Vivian staggered backward, her hands clutching her chest, as if her heart were actually giving out. The loss of her family, the impending arrest of DeAndre, the destruction of her husband's company, none of it had affected her as deeply and profoundly as the realization that she was about to be humiliated in front of her country club friends. The thought of being pitied by the women she had spent her life competing with was a fate worse than death. She let out a high-pitched, keening wail, her legs buckling beneath her. She collapsed back onto the ruined sofa, burying her face in the cushions, wailing with a pathetic, overwhelming grief that was entirely selfish. Sterling watched his wife break down. He watched her hyperventilate and sob over the loss of her gala tickets and country club lunches, while his billion-dollar company burned to ashes around them. He looked at Chloe, who was still rocking back and forth on the floor, weeping over her seized sports cars and fake marriage. He looked at DeAndre, who was standing by the door in federal handcuffs, waiting to be transported to a holding cell. Sterling finally realized the horrifying truth. The family he had built, the empire he had demanded I sacrifice my happiness to protect, was completely hollow. There was no loyalty, no strength, and no genuine love. He had surrounded himself with useless, greedy parasites who only cared about his money, and now that the money was gone, they were utterly incapable of surviving. The proud, tyrannical patriarch, who had controlled every aspect of my life, could not bear the weight of his own monumental failure. The realization crushed the very last ounce of fight out of him. Sterling let out a low, guttural groan, his eyes rolling back slightly in his head. His knees gave way, hitting the hard marble floor with a sickening thud. He slumped forward, his hands resting limply on the cracked glass of the coffee table, right next to the Vanguard heritage file that detailed his ruin. The great Sterling Rollins dropped to his knees utterly and completely broken, kneeling before the daughter he had thrown away. He did not attempt to get back up. For a man who had spent his entire adult life towering over everyone else, wielding his height and his wealth as weapons of mass intimidation, the sight of him crumpled on the imported marble was almost surreal. The immaculate crease of his charcoal trousers buckled and wrinkled beneath him, the expensive Italian wool pooling around his knees. His broad chest, usually puffed out in a permanent display of arrogant superiority, was now caved inward as if his ribs had physically collapsed under the crushing gravity of the situation. The room remained suspended in a breathless vacuum. Vivian had stopped her pathetic wailing, her tear-streaked face peeking over the edge of the velvet sofa, utterly captivated by the impossible destruction of her husband. Chloe was frozen on the floor, her own ruin momentarily eclipsed by the sight of our invincible father bowing in defeat. Even DeAndre, firmly restrained by the federal agents near the heavy oak doors, stared in wide-eyed disbelief. Sterling Rollins did not bow. Sterling Rollins did not break. He conquered, he commanded, and he destroyed. But right now he was nothing more than a terrified aging man stripped of his armor. His hands, normally steady and pointing with absolute authority, reached out toward me. They were shaking so violently that I could hear the faint clicking of his gold watch against his wristbone. He did not dare grab my clothes, perhaps sensing that Julian would immediately intervene, but his fingers hovered inches from my knees, an unspoken, desperate plea for salvation. When he finally looked up at me, the tyrannical fire that had burned in his eyes for decades was completely extinguished. They were hollow, bloodshot, and brimming with a pathetic, overwhelming panic. "Maya!" Sterling gasped, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of its commanding baritone. "Maya, please." I looked down at him. I did not step back and I did not flinch. I let him stay there on the floor, absorbing the full agonizing reality of his new position in the hierarchy. "You have to listen to me," he begged, his words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic stream. The polished corporate titan was gone, replaced by a beggar pleading for his life. "You have made your point. You have proven how smart you are. You have proven you are the most brilliant mind in this entire family. I see it now. I admit it. I was wrong, Maya. I was completely wrong about you, and I was entirely wrong about DeAndre. He is a fool, a criminal. Let them take him. Let the feds lock him away. He deserves it for stealing from me. For stealing from us. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He was willingly throwing his golden son-in-law to the wolves without a second of hesitation, proving once again that his only true loyalty was to his own survival. "But you cannot do this to the company," Sterling pleaded, his voice rising in pitch, cracking under the strain of his desperation. "You cannot destroy Sterling Logistics. I built that company with my bare hands. I poured 40 years of my life into that empire. It is my legacy. It is your legacy, Maya. You cannot just wipe out decades of history with a single signature. Think of the employees, think of the brand, think of me." He leaned forward slightly, his shaking hands coming together in a gesture of absolute submission. "I am an old man, Maya," he whispered, weaponizing his age, attempting to extract pity from the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating without a single ounce of mercy. "I cannot start over. I cannot survive bankruptcy at my age. The public humiliation will kill me. Please, Maya, give me 30 days to restructure. Give me a 30-day grace period to liquidate my private portfolios, to sell off the vacation properties to find replacement capital. I will pay Vanguard Heritage every single cent they are owed, plus penalties. I will give you a seat on the board. I will make you the chief financial officer. Just unfreeze the accounts. Call off the default. Please, Maya, I am your father." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a grotesque, unearned intimacy. He was invoking the sacred bond of blood, a bond he had actively severed the moment I refused to be a pawn in his social climbing chess game. He actually believed that biological proximity could magically erase a lifetime of psychological abuse and financial manipulation. I looked down at his trembling form, my expression remaining completely unreadable. I felt no surge of triumph, no vindictive thrill, and absolutely no pity. I was operating at the absolute zero of the emotional spectrum. I was exactly the cold analytical machine he had accused me of being, and I was about to use his own weapon against him. "Do you remember my wedding day, Dad?" I asked. My voice was quiet, conversational, yet it sliced through the grand foyer with the precision of a scalpel. Sterling blinked, completely thrown off guard by the sudden shift in topic. He stared up at me, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand where I was going with this. "My wedding day," I repeated, enunciating each word clearly. "2 years ago, while I was sitting in the bridal suite adjusting my dress and preparing to marry Julian, you walked into the room. You did not come in to congratulate me. You did not come in to tell me I looked beautiful or to offer me away. You brought your corporate attorney." Sterling's breath hitched. A flicker of recognition sparked in his bloodshot eyes. "You brought a stack of legal documents." I continued recounting the memory without a single trace of sorrow. "You were furious that I was marrying a public school teacher instead of the venture capitalist you had picked out for me. You told me that I was a massive disappointment, that I was embarrassing the family name, and that you were not going to let some broke nobody get his hands on the Sterling fortune. Do you remember the document you forced me to sign before you would allow the ceremony to proceed? The waiver." Sterling nodded frantically, his eyes widening. He remembered. Of course he remembered. He thought I was bringing it up to remind him that he was legally protected, that I had no claim to his money. He thought this was my twisted way of demanding my inheritance back in exchange for his corporate survival. "Yes," Sterling gasped out his words, stumbling over each other. "Yes, the waiver, the financial severance agreement. I remember, Maya. But we can tear it up. We can void that contract right now. I will have the lawyers draft a reinstatement tomorrow morning. I will put you back in the primary trust. I will make you the majority shareholder. Whatever you want, Maya. The waiver does not matter anymore." "You are right, it does not matter anymore," I replied, my voice chillingly calm. "Because it already served its purpose. But you clearly do not understand what that document actually did." I took a half step closer, forcing him to crane his neck upward, forcing him to look directly into the eyes of the architect of his destruction. "Vanguard Heritage is a highly regulated, internationally scrutinized financial institution. I explained, delivering the facts with the rhythmic, steady cadence of a boardroom presentation. Our compliance protocols are absolute. We adhere to the strictest anti-corruption and conflict of interest regulations in the global financial sector. When DeAndre violated the default covenants on the mezzanine loan, the system flagged Sterling Logistics for an immediate hostile audit. Because of the size of the loan and the severity of the breach, that audit had to be assigned to a senior forensic auditor. Sterling stared at me, his lips parted, his mind struggling to keep up with the legal mechanics I was laying out before him. "But I am your daughter," I stated smoothly. Under standard corporate compliance laws, a direct first-degree biological relationship constitutes a massive, unbreachable conflict of interest. An auditor cannot investigate freeze assets or authorize a hostile takeover of a corporation owned by their immediate family, especially if they are a named beneficiary in that family's financial trust. If I were still legally tied to your estate, Vanguard Compliance would have immediately flagged my assignment. They would have forced me to recuse myself. The investigation would have been handed over to a neutral third party, a process that takes months. It would have given you and DeAndre exactly the time you needed to hide the stolen funds, leverage more debt, and escape federal prosecution. I paused, letting the silence wrap around him like a suffocating shroud. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as the horrifying realization began to crystallize in his mind. "But I was not flagged," I whispered, delivering the killing blow. "Because of the waiver. By marching into my bridal suite and forcing me to sign away my rights, you formally and legally severed me from your estate. You legally dissolved my status as a beneficiary and officially categorized me as an independent, unrelated financial entity in the eyes of federal compliance regulators. You removed the conflict of interest." Sterling stopped breathing. The faint, trembling hope that had been clinging to his features evaporated instantly, replaced by an abyss of absolute, unmitigated despair. "You thought you were punishing me," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, triumphant finality. "You thought you were cutting me off and securing your precious wealth. But what you actually did was hand me the exact legal clearance I needed to execute this audit. Your own cruelty made this possible. If you had just been a decent father, if you had just let me get married in peace, I legally could not have touched your company. You literally handed me the legal clearance to dismantle your entire empire. You orchestrated your own destruction, Dad." The words slammed into him, crushing the last remaining fragments of his ego. The great patriarch had not been taken down by a faceless corporation or a rival tycoon. He had been taken down by his own monumental arrogance. He had handed the executioner the axe, sharpened the blade, and placed his own head on the chopping block. Sterling slumped forward, his hands pressing flat against the marble floor to keep himself from collapsing completely. He looked utterly hollowed out, a ghostly shell of the man he had been just hours prior. He stared at the floor for a long, agonizing moment, the silence broken only by the distant, muffled sound of Chloe sobbing on the carpet. When Sterling finally managed to lift his head, his face was devoid of anger, devoid of negotiation, and devoid of any lingering pride. There was only a profound, terrifying emptiness. He looked up at me, his voice barely a raspy, broken whisper, as he asked the only question he had left. "What are you going to do to me?" Vivian's perfectly manicured fingers clamped around my wrists with a desperate, claw-like grip. Her skin was freezing slick with the cold sweat of sudden, absolute panic. She looked up at me through a curtain of meticulously applied mascara, her eyes wide and brimming with heavy, theatrical tears. This was the performance of a lifetime. She had spent my entire existence perfecting the art of emotional manipulation, and now, facing the total annihilation of her pampered lifestyle, she was bringing out her heavy artillery. "Maya, my sweet, brilliant girl," Vivian whispered, her voice quivering with a fragile, manufactured vulnerability. She squeezed my hands, attempting to pull me closer, attempting to bridge a chasm she had spent 29 years digging with her own two hands. "You have to listen to me. You have to look into your mother's heart and understand why things were the way they were." I did not pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting her spin her web, watching the desperate mechanics of her mind working in overdrive as she sought the exact frequency to break my resolve. "I know I was hard on you," Vivian sobbed, a single perfectly timed tear tracking down her cheek, carefully avoiding her expensive blush. "I know I demanded perfection, and I know I pushed you away when you needed comfort. But you have to understand the world we live in, Maya. The world is incredibly cruel, especially to women who look like us. As a Black woman in these elite circles, you have to be twice as smart, twice as tough, and twice as ruthless just to get half the recognition. You were always so sensitive. You were always so soft-hearted. I had to toughen you up. I had to forge you into iron so the world would not break you. Every criticism, every time I favored your sister, it was a test. It was my way of protecting you. I was giving you the armor you needed to survive." She paused, letting out a ragged, trembling breath, waiting for the guilt to set in. She was waiting for the conditioned response of the desperate daughter seeking her mother's approval. When my expression remained completely unchanged, a wall of pure ice, she pivoted seamlessly. She abandoned the tough love mother routine and invoked a higher, almost sacred cause to shield her own rampant greed. "And now look at what you are doing," Vivian pleaded, her voice taking on a desperate preaching cadence echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer. "You are letting your petty, childish vindictiveness blind you to the bigger picture. Your father did not just build a company, he built a historic Black-owned empire. He built a beacon of excellence for our entire community. Do you know what our ancestors sacrificed so we could stand in a house like this? Do you know the blood and the sweat it took to build Sterling Logistics from absolutely nothing? We created generational wealth, Maya. And you are just going to burn it all to the ground because you felt left out of a few family dinners. You are going to hand our legacy over to some faceless federal agents over a simple misunderstanding, Maya. You are destroying our history. You are." The sheer audacity of her narrative was almost breathtaking. She was actually standing in a grand foyer bought with embezzled funds, looking at her favored son-in-law in federal handcuffs and trying to use the historical suffering of our ancestors to guilt-trip the auditor who caught them stealing. I looked down at her hands gripping my wrists. I did not yank them away. I simply rotated my arms and smoothly, forcefully detached myself from her grasp. I took a single step back, creating a definitive physical boundary between her fabricated emotion and my absolute reality. "Do not ever invoke the struggles of our ancestors to justify your profound, bottomless vanity, Mother," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, surgical edge that sliced straight through her manufactured tears and exposed the hollow core underneath. "You did not push me to be stronger. You pushed me away because I was not a useful accessory. I was not loud, I was not glamorous, and I did not photograph well for your country club newsletters. You did not give me armor. You gave me a lifetime of inadequacy while you wrapped Chloe in a protective layer of stolen money." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, her face flushing with indignant rage at being challenged, but I did not give her a fraction of a second to speak. I was the senior forensic auditor, and I was not entertaining fiction. "You did not care about a historic Black-owned business, Mother. You cared about your front row seats at the charity galas." I continued, my words hitting her like physical strikes, driving her backward. "You never cared about the legacy of Sterling Logistics. You cared about making sure your country club friends thought you were royalty. You cared about the prestige, the envy in their eyes, and the unlimited access to the VIP lounges." Sterling Logistics ceased to be a functioning logistics company 3 years ago. It became a personal slush fund to finance your desperate need to be the queen of the social scene. I pointed to the Vanguard heritage file resting on the cracked glass of the coffee table. "I traced the origin of every single dollar that funded your lifestyle." I stated, breaking down her entire existence into cold, unforgiving ledger entries. "The $50,000 platinum table you bought at the Heritage Foundation Gala last month, that was paid for directly out of the Sterling Employee Payroll Tax Escrow account. Your $100,000 initiation fee for the Oak Point Country Club, DeAndre diverted that from the company's regional warehouse maintenance budget. Your entire social identity is a highly leveraged, fraudulent illusion." Vivian shook her head rapidly, her carefully maintained posture finally breaking. Her hands flew to her neck, her fingers clutching at her heavy diamond necklace, as if she were suddenly suffocating. "No," she gasped, her voice losing all its theatrical grace and reverting to a raw, genuine panic. "No, those are private family expenses. Sterling handles the accounting. You do not know what you are talking about. You are confused." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, my gaze locking onto her terrified eyes, refusing to let her look away from the wreckage. "Because I am the one who cut the strings. When I signed the executive order to freeze Sterling Logistics operating accounts at 6 o'clock this morning, I did not just freeze the corporate payroll. I froze every single account linked to the company's routing numbers. That includes the shadow accounts DeAndre set up to auto-pay your personal expenses." The blood completely drained from Vivian's face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The pristine, untouched world she inhabited was suddenly shattering around her, and she was beginning to comprehend the immediate catastrophic social implications of my words. "Today is the first of the month, Mother," I reminded her, delivering the final fatal blow to her fragile ego. "Do you know what happens on the first of the month? The automatic drafts for your elite social club memberships, your country club dues, and your private society benefactor pledges are processed. Or rather, they attempt to process." I let the silence hang for a brief moment, watching the sheer, unadulterated terror wash over her features. "Every single one of your membership payments bounced this morning." I revealed, my voice steady and merciless. "But it gets worse. Because those club fees were historically paid using stolen corporate funds, Vanguard Heritage compliance protocols required me to formally notify the receiving institutions of the federal fraud investigation. I personally drafted the legal notices to the board of directors of the Oak Point Country Club, the Heritage Foundation, and the Diamond Society. I informed them that the money you have been paying them is currently subject to federal asset forfeiture." Vivian let out a strangled, horrific gasp. It was not a theatrical sob. It was the sound of a woman watching her actual life end. "Your entire social standing is gone," I stated, stripping away the very last remaining shred of her dignity. "Your memberships are revoked. Your seats at the galas are canceled. Your elite circle of friends will read those board notices before lunchtime. By tomorrow morning, every single woman you have spent the last decade trying to impress will know that you are completely bankrupt, that your son-in-law is a felon, and that you have been funding your lavish lifestyle with stolen money. You are a social pariah." Vivian staggered backward, her hands clutching her chest, as if her heart were actually giving out. The loss of her family, the impending arrest of DeAndre, the destruction of her husband's company, none of it had affected her as deeply and profoundly as the realization that she was about to be humiliated in front of her country club friends. The thought of being pitied by the women she had spent her life competing with was a fate worse than death. She let out a high-pitched, keening wail, her legs buckling beneath her. She collapsed back onto the ruined sofa, burying her face in the cushions, wailing with a pathetic, overwhelming grief that was entirely selfish. Sterling watched his wife break down. He watched her hyperventilate and sob over the loss of her gala tickets and country club lunches, while his billion-dollar company burned to ashes around them. He looked at Chloe, who was still rocking back and forth on the floor, weeping over her seized sports cars and fake marriage. He looked at DeAndre, who was standing by the door in federal handcuffs, waiting to be transported to a holding cell. Sterling finally realized the horrifying truth. The family he had built, the empire he had demanded I sacrifice my happiness to protect, was completely hollow. There was no loyalty, no strength, and no genuine love. He had surrounded himself with useless, greedy parasites who only cared about his money, and now that the money was gone, they were utterly incapable of surviving. The proud, tyrannical patriarch who had controlled every aspect of my life could not bear the weight of his own monumental failure. The realization crushed the very last ounce of fight out of him. Sterling let out a low, guttural groan, his eyes rolling back slightly in his head. His knees gave way, hitting the hard marble floor with a sickening thud. He slumped forward, his hands resting limply on the cracked glass of the coffee table right next to the Vanguard Heritage file that detailed his ruin. The great Sterling Rollins dropped to his knees utterly and completely broken, kneeling before the daughter he had thrown away. I looked down at the man kneeling on the imported marble. Sterling Rollins, the immovable object, the undisputed king of his own curated universe, was trembling. He had asked the question with the frail, breathless terror of a man who suddenly realized he was entirely at the mercy of the very person he had spent a lifetime treating without an ounce of it. His expensive tailored charcoal suit pooled and wrinkled awkwardly around his knees, a visual manifestation of his complete and total collapse. The broad chest, that he usually puffed out in a permanent display of arrogant superiority, was now caved inward as if his ribs had physically buckled under the crushing gravity of the situation. He was waiting for mercy. He was waiting for the biological instinct of a daughter to override the duty of an auditor. He was waiting for a lifeline that he had meticulously, systematically burned to ash years ago. "What am I going to do to you?" I repeated the question, letting it hang in the stifling, oppressive air of the grand foyer. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I didn't feel the burning, chaotic heat of anger. I felt a profound, absolute, and surgical coldness. It was the exact emotional detachment he had always criticized me for, the analytical mind he had called a liability, now weaponized and turned directly onto his own empire. "There will be no 30-day extension, Sterling," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying the irrefutable weight of a judge passing a final, unappealable sentence. I did not call him Dad. That title, along with every shred of familial loyalty, had been permanently revoked the moment he brought his lawyers into my bridal suite. There will be no restructuring period. There will be no graceful exit strategy. And there will be no quiet liquidation of your private offshore assets to save face in the country club locker room. Sterling's mouth opened and closed, his jaw working uselessly as if he were suffocating. He looked back at Vanguard Heritage file on the table as if hoping the documents inside had magically rewritten themselves. The time for negotiations, the time for backroom deals and gentlemen's agreements expired the exact second DeAndre decided to use Vanguard's mezzanine loan to purchase custom jewelry and fund a mistress in South Beach. I continued reciting the operational reality with pristine corporate clarity. Vanguard Heritage is executing an immediate, unyielding, hostile takeover of Sterling Logistics. A choked, guttural sound escaped Sterling's throat. As of this moment, we are absorbing all viable corporate assets to cover the defaulted loan. I stated the finality of the words, striking him like physical blows. We are initiating a complete top-to-bottom liquidation of the executive management team. Your corner office is currently being packed up by corporate security. Your building access badges have been deactivated. Your company is gone. "You cannot do this!" Sterling gasped, his voice a ragged, desperate wheeze. He reached a trembling hand toward the hem of my skirt but stopped inches away as if touching me would physically burn him. "I am your father. I am your blood. You cannot just take everything. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing." I crouched down, moving slowly, deliberately, until my eyes were entirely level with his. I wanted him to see the absolute void where my daughterly devotion used to reside. I wanted him to stare directly into the eyes of the executioner his own cruelty had created. "A month ago," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that commanded the dead silence of the entire room. "You stood in this exact foyer. I came to you not for money, not for a handout, but asking for a simple character reference for my firm. A simple signature to help me secure a promotion I had earned." Sterling flinched, the color continuing to drain from his already ashen face. He remembered. The memory surfaced through his blind panic, a ghost of his former arrogance returning to haunt him in his final moments of ruin. "You laughed in my face," I reminded him, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum, devastating impact. "You looked at me with absolute, undisguised disgust. You said failures don't get a single penny. You told me that I was a massive disappointment. You told me that because I refused to marry a venture capitalist to expand your portfolio, I was entirely on my own. You explicitly stated that you do not do charity for failures." I stood back up, smoothing the front of my blazer, towering over the broken patriarch. Well, Vanguard Heritage doesn't do charity for failures either, Sterling, I stated. You failed to audit your own books. You failed to hire a competent executive team, preferring a sycophant who married your favorite daughter over a qualified professional. You failed to protect your investors' capital because you were too busy funding my mother's gala tickets. You are officially permanently fired from your own company. You have absolutely nothing left. I stepped back, letting the absolute finality of the verdict settle over the wreckage of the family. I glanced over at Julian. My husband had stood silently by the grand staircase, an immovable, supportive sentinel throughout the entire confrontation. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't intervened unnecessarily. But his presence was the solid anchor keeping me grounded in the storm. He caught my eye, a silent, powerful communication passing between us. The financial execution was officially complete. It was time for the criminal proceedings to finish their brutal act. Julian gave a subtle, definitive nod to the federal agents waiting by the heavy oak doors. The lead agent, a massive man whose face seemed carved from solid granite, stepped forward with unyielding purpose. He grabbed DeAndre by the bicep, yanking him fully upright. DeAndre had been whimpering, but the sudden violent movement snapped him back to the terrifying reality of his situation. The agent adjusted his grip, securing the heavy steel handcuffs that were already biting into DeAndre's wrists. "DeAndre Rollins," the agent barked, his deep voice booming with absolute terrifying authority that cut straight through the pathetic sounds of Vivian's weeping. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the agent continued reading the Miranda rights, a cold, hard recitation of his impending loss of freedom, DeAndre completely lost whatever fragile shred of sanity he was still clinging to. The stark, undeniable reality of a federal penitentiary suddenly materialized before his eyes, replacing the yachts, the mansions, and the endless stream of stolen money. He began to thrash violently against the steel restraints, his face turning a blotchy, mottled purple as pure, unadulterated panic set in. "You can't do this!" DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking in high-pitched, pathetic hysteria. But he wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at the federal agents. He was looking directly at Sterling. The realization that Sterling had just desperately tried to sacrifice him to save the company broke the final toxic tether of their alliance. There was no honor among thieves. "You set me up!" DeAndre roared, spittle flying from his lips, as the agents began to physically drag his struggling body across the polished marble floor. "You threw me under the bus, you arrogant old bastard. You knew the accounts were bleeding. You told me to keep the lifestyle going. You wanted the cars. You wanted the private jets. You told me to make it happen, whatever it took." Sterling remained kneeling, too broken, too utterly defeated to even lift his head and defend himself against the vicious accusations of the son-in-law he had once worshipped as a financial prodigy. "I'm going to tell them everything!" DeAndre shrieked, his voice echoing violently off the soaring ceilings as the agents hauled him toward the front entrance. His designer shoes scuffed wildly against the floor, leaving dark marks on the pristine stone. "I'm going to turn over every single ledger I kept, the receipts. Sterling, you hear me? You're going down with me. You're going to die in a federal cell right next to mine." The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut with a deafening, conclusive thud, instantly cutting off DeAndre's hysterical, echoing screams. For a fleeting second, the grand foyer was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. Vivian was still hyperventilating on the ruined velvet sofa, her mascara running in thick, ugly black rivers down her cheeks as she mourned the death of her social status. Chloe was staring blankly at the empty space where her husband had just been dragged away, her perfect, highly curated reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. And Sterling, the untouchable titan of industry, was weeping silently onto the floor, a broken king in a ruined castle. And then a new sound began to build outside. It started as a low, heavy mechanical rumble, a rhythmic, unrelenting churning of massive diesel engines echoing up the long, manicured circular driveway. It was not the high-pitched whine of police cruisers or the smooth, quiet purr of sleek, luxury sedans. It was the distinct, undeniable sound of heavy commercial transport trucks. The air brakes hissed loudly, shaking the massive bay windows of the mansion. The screaming was over. The bank representatives had arrived to begin taking inventory of the estate. The question was a fragile, pathetic rasp entirely devoid of the booming authoritarian thunder that had defined Sterling Rollins for decades. He knelt on the imported marble, his expensive charcoal suit pooling awkwardly around his legs, a broken king awaiting the executioner's axe. He was staring up at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes, desperately searching for a flicker of daughterly devotion, a momentary lapse into pity that he could exploit. I looked down at the man who had demanded perfection, but rewarded only blind obedience. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no vindictive thrill, no surge of triumphant adrenaline, and certainly no mercy. I was exactly the cold, analytical machine he had accused me of being operating at absolute zero. "I am going to do exactly what my mandate requires, Sterling," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying the irrefutable weight of a judge delivering a final, unappealable sentence. "I am going to execute the protocol for a severe fraudulent default." Sterling's mouth opened and closed, his jaw working uselessly as he tried to draw breath. "There will be no 30-day extension," I stated, slicing through his previous frantic negotiations with clinical precision. "There will be no grace period. There will be no quiet liquidation of your private offshore assets to save face in the country club locker room, and there will absolutely be no restructuring of your debt." "Maya, please." He gasped, his hands pressing flat against the floor to keep himself from collapsing completely. "Vanguard Heritage is a highly regulated financial institution, not a family charity." I continued, my words striking him like physical blows. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Heritage is executing an immediate, unyielding hostile takeover of Sterling Logistics. We are absorbing all viable corporate assets to cover the defaulted mezzanine loan and the subsequent penalties. We are initiating a complete top-to-bottom liquidation of the executive management team. The forensic audit triggered an automatic default covenant. Vanguard Heritage has already secured federal court orders to freeze all secondary assets. The regional warehouse facilities in Chicago, Atlanta, and Dallas are currently being padlocked by our receivership teams. Your commercial fleet is being grounded and impounded as we speak. Your corner office is currently being packed up by corporate security. Your building access badges have been deactivated. The corporate servers are locked down." I paused, letting the absolute crushing finality of the verdict settle over the grand foyer. "Your empire is gone, Sterling," I said. "It ceased to be yours the moment you allowed your son-in-law to use it as a personal piggy bank." Sterling let out a low, guttural groan, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his total annihilation finally penetrated his thick layer of ego. He had spent his entire life climbing the social ladder, building a legacy of wealth and intimidation, and now he was watching it burn to ash in a matter of minutes. "A month ago," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous whisper that commanded the dead silence of the room. Sterling flinched, his head snapping up. A flicker of recognition sparked in his terrified eyes. "A month ago, I stood in this exact foyer," I reminded him, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum devastating impact. "I came to you not asking for a handout, but asking for a simple character reference for my firm. I asked for a fraction of your support to secure a promotion I had earned through my own hard work. Do you remember what you told me?" Sterling swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He remembered. The memory surfaced through his blind panic, a ghost of his former arrogance returning to haunt him in his final moments of ruin. "You laughed in my face." I recounted, my tone stripped of all emotion. "You looked at me with absolute, undisguised disgust because I had chosen a public school teacher over a venture capitalist. You told me that I was a massive disappointment. And then you looked me dead in the eye and said failures don't get a single penny." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating a permanent physical boundary between myself and the wreckage of my former family. "You were right, Dad," I said, weaponizing his own cruelty. Vanguard Heritage does not do charity for failures, Sterling. You failed to audit your own books. You failed to hire a competent executive team, preferring a sycophant who married your favorite daughter over a qualified professional. You failed to protect your investors' capital because you were too busy funding my mother's gala tickets and Chloe's imported sports cars. You built a house of cards on embezzlement and staggering incompetence, and you expected the global financial market to simply look the other way. I stared down at him, delivering the final killing blow to his corporate identity. You are officially permanently fired from your own company. You have absolutely nothing left. Sterling Rollins, the immovable object, the tyrannical patriarch, let out a shattered, breathless sob. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold marble floor, completely defeated. The financial execution was officially complete. But the consequences of their arrogance were not over. It was time for the criminal proceedings to finish their brutal act. I shifted my gaze away from the broken king and looked toward the grand staircase. Julian had stood silently by the mahogany banister, an immovable supportive sentinel throughout the entire confrontation. He had not gloated. He had not intervened unnecessarily. But his presence was the solid anchor keeping me grounded in the storm. He caught my eye, a silent, powerful communication passing between us. The ledger was balanced. Julian turned his attention to the heavy oak doors and gave a subtle, definitive nod to the federal agents waiting in the wings. The lead agent, a massive man whose face seemed carved from solid granite, stepped forward with unyielding professional purpose. He marched directly toward DeAndre, who was still trembling by the entryway, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction unfolding around him. The agent grabbed DeAndre by the bicep, his grip ironclad, and forcefully yanked the golden son-in-law fully upright. DeAndre let out a startled, pathetic yelp, the sudden violent movement snapping him back to the terrifying reality of his own situation. The agent smoothly adjusted his grip, securing the heavy steel handcuffs that were already biting tightly into DeAndre's wrists. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound echoed through the silent foyer. DeAndre Rollins, the lead agent, barked, his deep, authoritative voice booming through the house, instantly cutting through the sounds of Vivian's theatrical weeping. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. As the agent continued the cold, hard recitation of the Miranda rights, DeAndre completely lost whatever fragile shred of sanity he was still clinging to. The stark, undeniable reality of a federal penitentiary suddenly materialized before his eyes, replacing the luxury yachts, the offshore accounts, and the endless stream of stolen corporate money. He began to thrash violently against the steel restraints, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing wildly against the polished floor. "You cannot do this!" DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking in high-pitched, hysterical panic. "I am the chief financial officer. I have money. I have lawyers. You have the wrong man." The second agent moved in, grabbing DeAndre's other arm, easily overpowering the frantic, struggling man. They began to physically drag him toward the front doors. But DeAndre was no longer looking at the agents. He was not looking at Chloe, who was standing paralyzed in shock. He was looking directly at Sterling, who was still slumped on the floor in utter defeat. The realization that Sterling had just desperately tried to sacrifice him, that his father-in-law had eagerly offered him up to the wolves in a pathetic attempt to save the company, shattered the final toxic tether of their alliance. There was absolutely no honor among thieves. "You set me up!" DeAndre roared, spittle flying from his lips, his face turning a blotchy, mottled purple. He fought against the agents with the frantic energy of a cornered rat, twisting his neck to hurl his venom at the broken patriarch. "You threw me under the bus, you arrogant old bastard. You knew the accounts were bleeding. You knew exactly what I was doing." Sterling did not lift his head. He remained frozen on the marble, absorbing the vicious accusations without a single word of defense. "You told me to keep the lifestyle going," DeAndre shrieked, his voice echoing violently off the soaring ceilings as the agents hauled him closer to the exit. "You wanted the prestige. You wanted the private jets. You told me to make the numbers work, whatever it took. You wanted to pretend you were a billionaire, and you made me steal to fund your fake life. Chloe finally snapped out of her paralysis, letting out a horrified scream as she watched her husband being dragged away like a common criminal. "DeAndre!" she wailed, stumbling forward, but a stern look from the lead agent stopped her dead in her tracks. "I am going to tell them everything!" DeAndre bellowed, his voice growing raw and hoarse as the agents shoved him through the heavy front doors. "I'm going to turn over every single ledger I kept, the receipts. Sterling, do you hear me? You are going down with me. You are going to die in a federal cell right next to mine." The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut with a deafening, conclusive thud, instantly cutting off DeAndre's hysterical, echoing screams. For a fleeting second, the grand foyer was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. Vivian was still hyperventilating on the ruined velvet sofa, her mascara running in thick, ugly black rivers down her cheeks as she mourned the death of her elite social status. Chloe was staring blankly at the heavy wooden doors, her perfect, highly curated reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. And Sterling, the untouchable titan of industry, remained weeping silently on the floor, a broken king in a ruined castle. And then a new sound began to build outside. It started as a low, heavy mechanical rumble. It was a rhythmic, unrelenting churning of massive diesel engines echoing up the long, manicured circular driveway. It was not the high-pitched whine of police cruisers or the smooth, quiet purr of sleek luxury sedans. It was the distinct, undeniable sound of heavy commercial transport trucks. The harsh metallic hiss of air brakes sliced through the quiet, vibrating the massive bay windows of the mansion. The sound of heavy trucks pulling into the driveway interrupted the screaming. The bank representatives had arrived to begin taking inventory of the estate. They pushed past the heavy mahogany front doors, an army of men in crisp, slate-gray suits carrying heavy metal clipboards and thick rolls of neon red inventory tags. They moved with the terrifying synchronized efficiency of ants dismantling a massive rotting carcass. They possessed absolutely zero sentimentality and zero hesitation. To them, this grand foyer was not a home. It was a crime scene of financial negligence, a treasure trove of liquid assets waiting to be meticulously cataloged, seized, and sold to the highest bidder. They did not pause to look at Vivian, who was still draped dramatically over the white velvet sofa, sobbing into her manicured hands. They ignored Chloe, who was hyperventilating near the grand staircase, tearing at her hair in a state of absolute shock. They stepped right around Sterling, who was still kneeling on the imported marble floor, staring vacantly at the Vanguard heritage file that had sealed his doom. One of the lead agents immediately approached a massive 18th-century Ming Dynasty vase displayed proudly near the entryway. He slapped a bright red barcoded sticker directly onto its delicate porcelain base, made a quick clinical notation on his clipboard, and moved immediately to the next piece of expensive, ill-gotten furniture. The sheer indignity of strangers touching their prized possessions acted as a brutal catalyst. The pressure cooker of the room finally exploded, causing the remaining family members to violently turn on each other. The toxic, fragile ecosystem they had aggressively protected for decades began cannibalizing itself in real time. "How could you let him do this?" Chloe shrieked, her voice shrill and unhinged, abandoning her weeping to scream directly into her father's face. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Sterling. "You said you had everything under control. You let DeAndre ruin our lives. My cars are out there, my jewelry. How am I supposed to survive, you stupid old man?" Sterling, momentarily shaken from his catatonia by the sheer disrespect of his favorite daughter, bellowed back at her. The veins in his neck bulged as his blind panic mutated into venomous rage. "Do not speak to me like that. You married that incompetent thief. You spent the money faster than he could steal it. You are a spoiled, blind, useless parasite, and you dragged this family into hell." He turned his furious gaze toward Vivian, desperately seeking a new target for his monumental failure. "And you raised her to be this way. You demanded the galas. You demanded the private jets. You bled my company dry for your pathetic country club friends." Vivian wailed louder, her mascara running in thick, ugly black rivers down her cheeks, completely ruining her designer blouse. "Do not blame me for your weakness, Sterling. You were supposed to be the provider. What am I supposed to do now? What am I going to wear to church on Sunday? Everyone is going to know I am ruined. You ruined me." I stood in the exact center of the grand foyer, completely untouched by the crossfire of their venom. The ping-pong dialogue of blame and hatred, bouncing off the high ceilings, highlighted the deeply toxic, incredibly fragile nature of the family dynamic I had finally permanently escaped. There was no love here. There had never been love here. There was only a transactional arrangement of greed, and the transaction had just been violently terminated. I watched a second red inventory tag adhere to the polished wood of the grand piano Vivian loved so much. It was the final definitive stamp on the Rollins dynasty. There was absolutely nothing left to say. I did not owe them a grand theatrical speech. I did not owe them a final vindictive gloating remark to satisfy their twisted need for drama. I did not owe them a single tear, a hollow apology, or a dramatic farewell. The profound, suffocating silence of my departure would be infinitely more agonizing for them than any screaming match. A screaming match would imply that I still cared enough to engage, that they still held some emotional real estate in my mind. Silence meant they were already dead to me. I turned my head slightly, looking over at Julian. He was watching me with those calm, perceptive eyes, reading the exact frequency of my thoughts. He knew I had executed the surgical strike flawlessly. He knew the building was collapsing, and it was time to leave before the dust settled over the rubble. I gave him a single definitive nod. We were done here. We turned our backs on the chaos. We walked toward the open front doors, our footsteps matching in a steady, unhurried rhythm against the marble. We walked out of the grand foyer, leaving the screaming, the weeping, and the desperate, pathetic accusations behind us. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not hesitate. I stepped over the threshold and walked out into the crisp, biting afternoon air. The contrast between the suffocating, screaming nightmare inside the mansion and the clinical, organized reality outside was staggering. The sprawling, circular driveway was a scene of absolute methodical dismantling. 3 massive yellow repossession trucks were parked at aggressive angles, blocking the main exit. Heavy hydraulic ramps were lowering with loud mechanical hisses that cut through the quiet neighborhood. Men in heavy utility jumpsuits were already marching toward Chloe's imported sports cars, attaching heavy steel winches to the axles. The pristine, manicured lawns that my mother had spent thousands of dollars maintaining were being trampled by heavy work boots and moving equipment. But amidst the chaotic symphony of repossession, a completely different kind of power was waiting silently for us. Parked precisely between the leading tow truck and the grand stone fountain was a sleek, midnight black Maybach. It was long, impossibly immaculate, and built with military-grade ballistic armoring. The tinted windows were pitch black, reflecting the chaos of the driveway like a dark, unforgiving mirror. Standing sharply at attention beside the rear passenger door was Marcus Julian's personal driver. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his posture rigid, his expression an impenetrable mask of absolute professionalism. My family had spent my entire adult life mocking Julian. They had laughed at his modest public school teacher salary. They had sneered at his chosen profession, treating him like a peasant who had somehow stumbled into the king's court. They had actively barred him from their elite circles, completely blind to the fact that while Sterling was busy inflating his fraudulent empire with stolen corporate debt, Julian and I had been quietly, ruthlessly building an entirely legitimate one of our own. The teacher disguise had been a convenient quiet cover for a man who managed a highly aggressive, deeply lucrative private equity portfolio. Sterling had been so obsessed with loud, flashy wealth and designer labels that he fundamentally could not recognize the silent, lethal architecture of real generational power standing right in front of him. Marcus saw us approaching and smoothly pulled the heavy armored door open, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Rollins Hayes." Marcus greeted me, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut easily through the grating noise of the tow trucks backing up. "Good afternoon, sir." Thank you, Marcus, Julian replied effortlessly, sliding his hand gently against the small of my back to guide me. Julian ushered me into the cavernous interior of the Maybach. I slid onto the hand-stitched heated leather seat, sinking into the luxurious depth of the cabin. Julian climbed in beside me, and Marcus closed the door with a solid vault-like thud. The moment the heavy door sealed, the aggressive noise of the outside world vanished entirely. The hissing brakes of the repo trucks, the shouts of the bank auditors carrying out boxes of documents, the distant muffled screams of my family echoing from the open doors of the mansion, it was all instantly erased. The cabin of the Maybach was a sanctuary of absolute pin-drop silence. It smelled of rich, authentic leather and subtle, expensive cologne. The climate control hummed with a barely perceptible soothing whisper. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest, letting my eyes flutter shut for just a fraction of a second. The icy analytical machine that had executed the hostile takeover slowly began to power down. The frigid adrenaline that had kept my spine rigid and my voice steady for the last hour slowly drained out of my system. It was replaced by a profound, heavy, and undeniable sense of peace. The war was officially over. I had marched into the dead center of the toxic wasteland that had poisoned my entire childhood, and I had systematically dismantled it brick by brick. I was finally truly free from their shadow. I opened my eyes and looked out through the heavily tinted bulletproof glass. The Maybach began to glide forward smoothly, the massive engine completely silent, as Marcus navigated flawlessly around the fleet of repossession vehicles. I watched the grand imposing facade of the Sterling mansion slide past my window. I looked at the towering marble columns, the sweeping balconies, the massive oak doors that were supposed to signify untouchable prestige. It was a monument to a fragile ego, a fortress built on lies, intimidation, and the constant systematic crushing of anyone who dared to demand basic human respect. It was the mansion I used to call home. I watched the repossession teams hooking up Chloe's yellow sports car, the winch groaning as it pulled the vehicle onto the flatbed. I watched the bank auditors carrying out heavy white banker's boxes, overflowing with financial records. I watched the empire crumble into the dirt, and I felt absolutely no regret. They had dug their own graves with their bare hands, and I had simply refused to take the shovel away from them. I turned away from the window, dismissing the Rollins estate from my mind permanently. I looked at my husband. Julian was watching me, his dark eyes warm, proud, and incredibly grounded. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask if I felt guilty or conflicted about destroying my own bloodline. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly what this required of me. He reached forward and opened the sleek, polished wood console positioned between our seats. Inside rested a small, chilled compartment. He retrieved a frosted glass bottle of sparkling water and two heavy crystal tumblers. The faint, crisp pop of the bottle opening was the only sound in the silent cabin. He poured the water smoothly, the carbonation fizzing lightly against the crystal. He handed me a glass, his fingers brushing gently against mine. The warmth of his touch was a stark, beautiful contrast to the freezing temperature I had maintained all afternoon. Julian leaned back against his own leather seat, holding his glass. A slow, deeply proud smile spread across his handsome face. He looked at me not just as his wife, but as an equal, as a partner, and as the most brilliant, ruthless financial mind he had ever encountered. "So," Julian asked softly,